My dear child, your flight record just crossed my desk, and the hours you logged in small aircraft when nobody was watching have accumulated to the exact total the clearance authority requires before issuing the certification for the largest aircraft in the hangar, which means you are not being asked to log more hours in the small. You are being cleared for the big. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about eventually being rewarded for faithfulness in the general spiritual sense. This is about a clearance, a specific flight record reviewed, hours verified. The certification is being issued right now clearance that is being produced by the accumulated total of every small faithful moment that was logged into a record the pilot did not know was being maintained by a clearance authority whose certification process was operating the entire time the pilot was flying small. The record is complete. The clearance is being issued, and the aircraft is the largest one. You have been faithful in the small things, the quiet responsibilities, the unglamorous assignments, the invisible excellence that produced no applause and attracted no audience. You showed up to the small aircraft and flew with the precision the small aircraft required, and landed with the consistency the small aircraft demanded. And the flying was performed in places nobody thought to watch by a pilot whose logged hours were accumulating in a record the pilot did not know existed. My beloved child, you have been watching people who seem to log fewer hours receive larger aircraft. The watching has been producing the specific. Maybe the small does not connect to the big. Maybe the hours are just hours, suspicion that the small faithfulness was never part of a certification process and was simply what good people do without any guarantee that the big follows. Stay here. What I reveal next is what the flight record contains and why the clearance being issued tonight is calibrated precisely to the hours you logged when nobody was counting. Type clearance issued if you have been faithful in the small things without visible reward, logging hours in invisible places nobody thought to watch. And God just told you the flight record crossed His desk, and the accumulated total has reached the exact certification threshold the clearance authority requires before issuing the clearance for the largest aircraft in the hangar. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The flight record was not assembled from a single category of hours. It was compiled from every category of small faithfulness the certification requires, which means the clearance authority was logging different types of hours across different types of small aircraft the entire time the pilot was flying, without knowing. Each type was a separate column in a certification document whose total columns had to be filled before the clearance for the largest aircraft could be issued. My beloved child, I need you to understand how a divine flight record operates. A human flight record tracks one number, total hours flown. A divine flight record tracks categories, the specific, verified. Each column represents a different dimension of the faithfulness the big aircraft requires, categorical system that logs not merely how many hours the pilot flew, but what kind of faithfulness each hour represented. Total hours are not enough. Category completion is what the clearance requires. My dear one column logged the hours you were faithful when the faithfulness was boring. Another column logged the hours you were faithful when the faithfulness was painful. Another logged the hours you were faithful when the faithfulness was unwitnessed. Another logged the hours you were faithful when the faithfulness was actively unrewarded, while the unfaithful were visibly rewarded around you. Each category was a separate qualification, and each qualification had its own threshold. Every column just reached its threshold simultaneously, and simultaneous completion across all categories is what produces the clearance. This message was not released for everyone who has been faithful. This was aimed at the one person whose specific multi-category, every column filled, boring and painful, and unwitnessed and unrewarded flight record has just crossed the clearance authority's desk at the simultaneous completion point that produces the certification. The person who does not know the small faithfulness was being logged in categories, and the categories just filled, and the clearance being issued requires exactly the record the viewer unknowingly built. Type every column filled if the flight record was tracking categories rather than just total hours. Faithfulness when boring, faithfulness when painful, faithfulness when unwitnessed, faithfulness when the unfaithful were visibly rewarded instead, and every column just reached its threshold simultaneously because the certification for the largest aircraft requires multi-category completion, and the viewer's specific record just crossed the simultaneous completion point that produces the clearance authority is issuing tonight. I have been reviewing the flight record since the first hour was logged, and the reviewing has been the specific clearance authority level. I have been tracking every category in every column across every small aircraft the pilot ever flew. Attention of a god, whose certification desk has been receiving entries from a pilot who did not know the desk existed, or that the hours being flown in invisible places were being recorded by an authority whose clearance process was always aimed at this specific aircraft. My dear one, not from the control tower observing the small flights at a distance, from the cockpit, in the small aircraft, present during every logged hour. The specific I was in the co-pilot's seat during the boring hours. I was in the co-pilot's seat during the painful hours. I was in the co-pilot's seat during the unwitnessed hours. Proximity of an authority who was not merely tracking the hours from a record, but was present in the aircraft while the hours were being accumulated. I was in the cockpit for every logged hour, in every small aircraft. My beloved child, I watched the specific small assignment that logged the most critical category hour in the entire record. There was a moment, a specific, unglamorous, nobody would ever celebrate this moment, where you performed an act of faithfulness so quietly and so precisely in a category whose column was approaching its threshold that the single hour logged by. That single act was the hour that completed the column. No other act of faithfulness had been able to fill. That hour completed the hardest column, and the hardest column was the last one remaining. I chose you for this message because the simultaneous completion of every column was triggered by the most invisible act of faithfulness in the entire record. The act that no human being observed, that no recognition was produced for, that the pilot performed without any awareness that the performing was completing the final column in a certification document whose every other column was already full. My child, the most invisible hour completed the certification, and the certification is why the clearance is being issued tonight. Type invisible hour if God was in the cockpit for every logged hour across every small aircraft. And the most invisible act of faithfulness in the entire record was the specific hour that completed the hardest and last remaining column in the certification document, meaning the most unwitnessed moment of small faithfulness triggered the simultaneous completion that produces the clearance for the largest aircraft, and the pilot who performed it had no awareness the performing was completing the final qualification. I know what the small aircraft season has been doing to the specific part of you where your belief that the small connects to the big is maintained, my beloved child. The small was not always painful. In the early flights, the small carried its own significance. The specific, I am building toward something. The small aircraft is preparation for the larger one. Every logged hour is moving me closer energy that a pilot carries when the training is new, and the connection between the small flights and the eventual clearance feels alive and traceable. The early small flights were sustained by the proximity of the connection, and proximity-sustained flying produces purposeful hours. The connection faded as the small flights accumulated without producing the clearance. My child, I watched the connection fade through the accumulation of unrewarded hours. Each small, faithful act that was performed without visible promotion to a larger aircraft added distance between the small and the big in the pilot's internal system. The distance between the current small aircraft and the imagined large aircraft widened with every flight that ended at the same small hangar the pilot had been returning to since the logging began. And a pilot whose distance between small and big widens with every logged hour is a pilot whose belief in the connection between the two is thinning at the rate the distance is growing. The belief thinned, and thinned belief logs different hours. I watched the thinning produce its specific grief at the layer where the pilot's sense of progression is maintained. The grief was not about the small aircraft being insufficient. The grief was about the small aircraft being permanent. The specific, I will fly small for the rest of my career. The clearance is not coming. The hours are accumulating without producing the certification. They were supposed to be aimed at grief that a pilot produces when the small flights have lasted long enough that the small feels like the destination rather than the training. The small became the destination in the pilot's mind, while the certification desk was processing the record toward the clearance. The deepest wound the small aircraft season produced was not the thinning of the belief in the connection. It was watching other pilots receive clearance for larger aircraft after what appeared to be fewer logged hours, producing the specific suspicion that the clearance authority was issuing certifications based on something other than the flight record, and that the record the viewer was building through quiet consistency was not the variable the authority was evaluating. My dear child, you watched them fly larger, pilots whose logged hours appeared shorter, whose small aircraft season appeared briefer, whose transition from small to large appeared to require less of the accumulation the viewer's certification was demanding. Their clearance arrived sooner, their aircraft were bigger, and the comparison between their apparently shorter record and the viewer's apparently longer one produced the specific. The system is not based on hours. The clearance is based on something I do not carry conclusion that the comparison was always going to install. The conclusion attacked the system, not the pilot's capacity. My beloved child, I watched the conclusion produce its most devastating effect at the specific intersection of faithfulness and futility. The intersection is where a pilot who has been logging hours longer than anyone in the hangar begins to wonder whether the logging itself is the futility, whether the faithfulness that produces the hours is simply the activity a good person performs while the clearance is being issued to others based on criteria the faithful person does not meet. The wandering classified faithfulness as irrelevant to clearance. And irrelevant faithfulness is the most expensive conclusion the small aircraft season can produce in a pilot whose record was always the primary variable the clearance authority was evaluating. My dear one, the pilots who received earlier clearance were flying different aircraft categories with different certification requirements and different hour thresholds calibrated to different assignments. Their clearance was not evidence that fewer hours produce the same certification. Their clearance was evidence that smaller aircraft produce shorter records because smaller aircraft are aimed at smaller assignments. Your record is longer because your aircraft is larger, and larger aircraft require longer records. Type longer means larger if you watched other pilots receive clearance after what appeared to be fewer hours. And the comparison produced the conclusion that the system is not based on the record, but the pilots who received earlier clearance were certified for different aircraft, with different hour thresholds, calibrated to different assignments, meaning their shorter record produced certification for smaller aircraft, while your longer record is producing certification for the largest aircraft in the hangar, because larger aircraft require longer records, and longer records are the evidence of larger clearance, not slower processing. The longer record was never evidence that the clearance was delayed. It was evidence that the aircraft being cleared for was the largest in the hangar, and the largest aircraft in the hangar requires the longest record, because the certification threshold for the largest aircraft is proportional to the magnitude of what the cleared pilot will be. Trusted to fly, my beloved one. I need to permanently separate the length of the small aircraft season from the verdict the length was installing. Your system classified the extended season as evidence that the clearance was not coming, that the hours were accumulating without producing the certification they were supposed to be aimed at. The truth is, the extended season was evidence that the certification being produced was the highest the system contains, because high certification clearances require more categories, more columns, more thresholds, and more verified hours than standard certification clearances demand. Extended logging means highest clearance, not absent clearance. My child, a pilot cleared for a small aircraft after a short record is a pilot whose certification matches the record. A pilot cleared for the largest aircraft after the longest record is a pilot whose certification also matches the record. The matching is the system's design. Short records match small aircraft. Long records match large aircraft. And the matching means the length of the record was always the measurement of the size rather than the measurement of the delay. The length measured the size, not the weighting. My dear one, every unglamorous flight in the small aircraft was an hour logged toward the highest certification the system issues, not a standard certification, the highest. And the highest certification is the one the clearance authority issues to the pilot, whose record demonstrates the specific, multi-category, every column filled, boring and painful and unwitnessed and unrewarded faithfulness that the largest aircraft demands in the pilot who flies it. The small flights were never small. The small flights were the logging process for the largest clearance. And the largest clearance just reached its threshold. The certification document just moved from the review desk to the issuing desk, and the specific, record verified, every column confirmed, the authority is preparing the clearance paperwork transfer that is occurring in the clearance system right now is producing the first atmospheric evidence that the small aircraft season is ending, and the largest aircraft clearance is being processed for formal issuance. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days. Not in the small aircraft, in the atmosphere around the flying. The specific, almost imperceptible. Something about the way my assigned air arriving just changed. The small is starting to feel like it is wrapping up shift that a pilot produces when the certification moves from review to issuance, and the proximity of the clearance begins affecting the pilot's experience of the small flights before the clearance is formally delivered. The wrapping up is not the small ending without replacement. The wrapping up is the small completing its purpose. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens when a certification document moves from the review desk to the issuing desk. The review desk evaluates. The issuing desk produces. The transfer between the two means the evaluation is complete and the production of the clearance has begun. The specific, the record was reviewed and approved. The hours are verified. The categories are confirmed. The clearance is being printed stage of the certification process that occurs after the review is satisfied and before the clearance is formally placed in the pilot's hands. The clearance is being printed. For your specific flight record, I have been managing the certification process behind every season of small aircraft flying. While the belief was thinning and the comparison was installing, and the futility was classifying the faithfulness as irrelevant, I was at the review desk, verifying hours, confirming categories, ensuring every column the certification requires was being filled by the specific type of small faithfulness each column was designed to measure. My child, the verification is complete, the confirmation is done, the clearance is being printed, and what is being printed is the highest certification the system has ever produced for a single pilot's record. Type clearance printing. If something shifted in the atmosphere around the small assignments within the last few days, a wrapping up quality the small flights did not carry before. And the shift is the certification document moving from the review desk to the issuing desk, because the evaluation is complete, and the production of the highest clearance the system contains is being processed for formal issuance based on a flight record whose every column was verified and confirmed by the authority who has been managing the certification behind every season of small aircraft flying. You have been faithful in the small things, and now watch me be faithful in the big things. The title carries that specific sequential connection because the small and the big are not two separate categories operating independently, but are two stages of a single certification process, whose first stage produces the record, the second stage issues the clearance from, and the transition from stage 1 to stage 2 is what tonight represents, my dear one. I need you to understand the weight of the phrase, "Now watch me." The title does not say, "Eventually God will be faithful." Does not say, "Someday the big things will arrive." Says, "Now watch me." Now is a transition word. The specific, the small stage just completed, the big stage commencing, the certification is being issued. At this moment, temporal marker that connects the faithfulness in the small to the faithfulness in the big with the immediacy the now carries. Now means the transition is happening, not approaching, happening. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific disconnection the small aircraft season was producing between the small faithfulness and the big outcome. The title says you have been faithful in the small. The flight record confirms it. The title says, "Now watch me be faithful in the big." The clearance being processed confirms it, and the connection between the two, the specific. your faithfulness in the small produced. The record my faithfulness in the big is, responding to sequential linkage, is the system's design that the disconnection was preventing the pilot from seeing. My child, the small faithfulness and the big faithfulness are not two parallel tracks that may or may not intersect. They are two sequential stages of a single track. The first stage being the pilot's faithfulness in logging the hours, and the second stage being the authority's faithfulness in issuing the clearance the hours produced. The pilot was faithful in stage 1. The authority is being faithful in stage 2. And stage 2 is not a separate event from stage 1. Stage 2 is the response to stage 1. The response is tonight, because stage 1 just completed. The clearance document is being walked toward the pilot right now, my beloved child, and the specific, authority signed, record verified, every category confirmed, the highest certification. The system issues formality with which the clearance is being carried toward the pilot, who logged every hour in small aircraft. Without knowing the hours we're building toward, the largest aircraft in the hangar is producing the final moments before the small aircraft season ends and the large aircraft season begins. I need you to feel the proximity of the clearance, not the distant. Keep being faithful in the small, and eventually the big will come. Log more hours and trust the process proximity that the small aircraft season was producing as the default relationship between the pilot and the possibility of flying larger. The present tense, document in hand, authority walking toward the pilot. The certification is being delivered in the next moment's proximity of a clearance, whose processing is complete, and whose delivery requires only the handing of the signed document from the authority to the pilot whose record produced it. The authority is walking, the document is signed, and the handing is about to happen. My dear one, everything has been building toward this handing. The first small flight that was logged without knowing a record existed. The early hours sustained by the proximity of the connection between small and big. The thinning that occurred as the connection faded under accumulated unrewarded hours. The comparison with pilots who received clearance sooner for smaller aircraft. The futility that classified faithfulness as irrelevant. The small becoming the destination in the pilot's mind while the certification desk was processing the record toward the clearance. The invisible hour that completed the final column. The simultaneous completion across all categories. The review that verified every hour. And now, the handing. The specific authority to pilot. Signed, clearance being placed into the hands of the pilot who logged every hour moment, whose arrival converts the small aircraft pilot into the large aircraft pilot in a single document transfer. My child, the transfer is one handoff away. The authority is here, and the document carries the largest clearance the system has ever issued to a single pilot's record. Type document arriving if the clearance is being walked toward you right now. Authority signed, record verified, every category confirmed, and the handing that is about to happen converts the small aircraft season into the large aircraft season in a single document transfer because the certification process is complete and the delivery requires only the placing of the signed clearance into the hands of the pilot, whose logged hours in invisible places produced the largest certification the system has ever issued to a single record. The clearance just landed in your hands. The document is signed, and the pilot, who logged thousands of hours in small aircraft, without knowing the hours, were building toward the largest certification the system contains, is now holding the clearance that converts every unglamorous, invisible, unrewarded hour of small faithfulness into the authorization to fly the largest aircraft in the hangar. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment small connects to the big, with the force of a signed clearance placed into the hands of the pilot whose record produced it. The moment the disconnection that separated the small faithfulness from the big outcome is abolished by the physical evidence of a certification document, whose every line references the hours that were logged in the small aircraft the pilot believed were leading nowhere. The moment the pilot who suspected the small and the big were separate categories discovers they are sequential stages of a single track, and the transition between the two just occurred in the handing of a document the flight record spent years producing. The small just produced the big. In the pilot's own hands, you have been faithful in the small things, and now watch me be faithful in the big things. The title said, faithful in the small. The record confirms it. The title said, now watch me. The clearance confirms it. And the pilot holding the signed certification is processing the specific. The hours were always being logged. The categories were always being filled. The record was always aimed at this clearance. Every small faithful moment was a qualification hour revelation that only a clearance document issued at the completion of a multi-category certification process can produce. My child, the clearance does not say you are now permitted to try the big aircraft. The clearance says you are certified. Certified is the authority's confirmation that the record has produced a pilot whose logged hours demonstrate the capacity the largest aircraft requires. And demonstrated capacity through logged hours is the only basis the clearance authority issues the highest certification on. The capacity was demonstrated through the small, and the demonstrated is why the clearance was issued. For the big, now that the clearance is in the pilot's hands and the certification is signed, and the small just produced the big everything about the disconnection identity that governed the pilot's relationship between small faithfulness and big outcome is being permanently demolished by the evidence of a signed document whose every line traces the clearance back to the hours that were logged in the small aircraft the pilot believed were leading nowhere. My dear child, this is what happens when a pilot who suspected the small and the big were separate categories receives the clearance that proves the two are sequential stages of a single certification process. The disconnection does not merely adjust, it is abolished, because the disconnection was built on the premise that the small faithfulness was spiritually meaningful, but practically disconnected from anything that would produce the big. And the signed clearance just demonstrated that the small faithfulness was the specific, practical, category-filling, threshold-reaching, certification-producing mechanism the big was always waiting on. The small was always the mechanism, and the mechanism just produced its output. My beloved child, the abolishing is producing cascading effects across every area of your identity where the disconnection was governing your relationship with faithfulness. The futility that classified faithfulness as irrelevant to clearance is being overturned. Because the clearance was issued on the basis of the faithfulness the futility said was disconnected. The thinned belief in the connection between small and big is being restored, not to its original proximity-sustained level, but to a certification-verified level that exceeds the original because post-clearance belief carries the signed document the pre-thinning belief was operating without. Post-clearance belief exceeds pre-thinning belief because post-clearance has evidence, and the small faithfulness that was being performed with the purposeless quality of maintenance is being retroactively reclassified as the most productive activity the pilot was performing during the entire logging season because the maintenance quality faithfulness was filling categories. The pilot did not know existed in a record. The pilot did not know was being maintained toward a clearance. The pilot did not know was being processed. The most purposeless feeling hours were the most certification productive. And the retroactive is the clearance's gift. Type retroactive purpose if the disconnection just collapsed under the signed clearance. The futility overturned. The belief restored at certification verified level. The purposeless feeling faithfulness retroactively reclassified as the most productive activity of the entire season. Because the maintenance quality hours were filling categories, the pilot did not know existed in a record aimed at a clearance. The pilot did not know was being processed, meaning the most purposeless feeling faithfulness was the most certification productive, and the retroactive reclassification is the clearance document's gift to the pilot whose record produced it. Let me show you what your life looks like. Now that the clearance is signed and the certification is in your hands, and the largest aircraft in the hangar is being prepared for the pilot, whose small aircraft record produced the highest clearance the system has ever issued. Because a person flying with a signed clearance for the largest aircraft moves through the airspace at a capacity the small aircraft version could never have accessed. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the altitude. You have been flying at small aircraft altitude, the specific, low ceiling, limited range. The airspace available to this aircraft is proportional to the aircraft's size flight experience that a pilot produces when the certification only authorizes the small aircraft and the small aircraft only accesses the small airspace. The altitude was not the pilot's limitation. The altitude was the aircraft's limitation, and the aircraft's limitations was the certification's limitation. The certification just upgraded, and upgraded certification accesses higher altitude. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the small. The first conscious awareness of each day, processing the familiar, same small aircraft, same small altitude, same small airspace. Another day of logging hours in the same category of assignment protocol that the small aircraft season was installing as the default morning reality. Tomorrow you wake into the cleared. The morning processes at a different level because the certification now authorizes the largest aircraft, and the largest aircraft accesses airspace the small aircraft could never enter. Cleared mornings carry altitude. Small mornings carried ceiling. The assignments ahead of you are going to operate at a scale the small aircraft assignments could never have contained. The small assignments required small aircraft capacity. The assignments positioned at the altitude the largest aircraft accesses require the specific multi-category certified, every column verified, highest clearance issued capacity that only a pilot whose small aircraft record produced the largest certification can bring to the airspace the largest assignments occupy. Large aircraft assignments await at altitudes the small aircraft could never reach. People around you are going to notice the altitude change before you describe the clearance, because a person whose certification just upgraded from small aircraft to largest aircraft carries an atmospheric authority that the small aircraft, low sailing, limited range version could never generate, regardless of how precisely the small aircraft version was flying within the airspace the small certification permitted. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the small aircraft season, who interacted with the low-altitude version, who received the I am doing excellent work in a small space energy, who sensed the specific quality of a person whose capacity exceeded the aircraft they were certified to fly, and whose precision in the small was visibly disproportionate to the size of the assignment the small aircraft represented. Those people are about to encounter the largest aircraft version. They will say, "You were always meant for something bigger than what you were flying." They will mean the clearance finally matched the capacity. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when the certification catches up to the capacity. When the clearance finally authorizes the aircraft, the pilot's skill set was always designed to fly. The quality is not ambition fulfilled. It is the specific. The record was always building toward this. The small was always the qualification for the large. Every logged hour was a step in a certification process. I did not know existed quality of a person whose relationship between faithfulness and outcome has been permanently reconnected by the evidence of a clearance whose every line references the hours that were logged in places nobody thought to watch. The quality is certification-verified authority, and certification-verified authority attracts what uncertified precision could not. Connections that require the specific atmospheric quality of a person whose largest aircraft clearance was produced by small aircraft faithfulness are approaching the certified pilot right now. There are co-pilots and assignments and airspace-level partnerships whose formation demands the specific. Small proved the big, the record speaks. Every hour was logged authority that only a pilot whose clearance was earned through invisible faithfulness can carry. My dear one, what approaches certification-verified authority is calibrated to the aircraft the certification authorizes. And largest aircraft connections exceed anything the small aircraft season was producing. Type certification verified. If the clearance is producing an atmospheric authority the small aircraft version could never carry. The specific, record speaks, small prove the big. Every hour was logged quality of a pilot whose certification finally matches the capacity, and connections requiring the specific authority of someone whose largest aircraft clearance was earned. Through invisible small aircraft faithfulness are approaching, because certification-verified authority attracts what uncertified precision in the small could never produce. And the partnerships forming around the cleared pilot are calibrated to the aircraft the certification authorizes. I need you to understand why I required the full flight record in the small before issuing the clearance for the large rather than certifying the pilot based on potential alone. Because the requirement reveals something about the kind of pilot I always intended the largest aircraft to be flown by, that a potential certified, untested, never logged the hours pilot could never have become my beloved child. I could have certified on potential. The capacity was visible from the beginning. The raw ability to fly larger was detectable in the pilot's handling of the first small aircraft. The specific, this pilot carries more than the small aircraft requires. The skill set exceeds the assignment quality that a clearance authority recognizes when our pilot's capacity is disproportionate to the aircraft they are currently flying. I saw the capacity early. I required the record anyway, and the requiring tells you something. My child, potential certified pilots carry capacity without character. Record certified pilots carry capacity with character. And the distinction between the two is the distance between a pilot who can fly the largest aircraft and a pilot who should fly the largest aircraft. Can is ability, should is character, and character is what the logged hours in the small aircraft produce in the pilot who logs them. Character is not teachable at altitude. Character is developed at ground level. My dear one, I chose you for the record certification process because the largest aircraft in the hangar carries an assignment whose execution requires the specific character the small aircraft hours developed. Not the skill, the character. The specific, I was faithful when nobody watched, I was excellent when the assignment was unglamorous. I logged hours that produced no applause, and I flew with the same precision I would have flown with in front of an audience character that the small develops in the pilot, the large needs. The large needs what the small produced, not the skill the pilot already carried. The character the hours developed, and developed character in the largest cockpit, produces a different quality of flying than raw ability in the same cockpit could ever generate. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most small aircraft-hardened objection in its inventory. The voice that says the largest aircraft might be too much for a pilot whose entire record was logged in small aircraft, and that the distance between small aircraft precision and large aircraft operation might be a distance the accumulated hours cannot bridge, regardless of how many categories were filled, my child. It sounds like this. I have only ever flown small. The small aircraft is what I know. The controls are familiar. The airspace is navigable. The assignments are manageable within the capacity the small aircraft provides. The largest aircraft operates at a scale I have never experienced. Different controls, different altitude, different complexity, different consequences for every decision the pilot makes at the speed the largest aircraft travels. The clearance says I am certified, but certified on paper and capable in the cockpit are separated by the distance between a record reviewed at a desk and a pilot operating at altitude. That doubt just evaluated the pilot's readiness by the pilot's experience rather than by the clearance authority's certification. And the clearance authority's certification outranks the pilot's self-assessment. My beloved child, the clearance authority does not issue the highest certification based on the pilot's self-assessment of readiness. The clearance authority issues the highest certification based on the authority's comprehensive review of the record. A review whose evaluation criteria include dimensions the pilot's self-assessment does not have access to. The authority reviewed categories the pilot did not know were being logged. The authority verified hours the pilot did not know were being counted. And the authority's certification is based on data the pilot has never seen. The authority has more data about the pilot's readiness than the pilot does, and more data produces more accurate certification. You do not feel ready because the pilot never feels ready for the largest aircraft. The authority knows you are ready because the authority has the record, and the record outranks the feeling the way verified data outranks unverified self-assessment. Type authority certified if the doubt argued the largest aircraft might be too much for a small aircraft pilot. And the distinction the doubt cannot account for is that the clearance authority does not issue the highest certification based on pilot's self-assessment, but based on a comprehensive review of a record containing categories and hours the pilot did not know were being tracked, meaning the authority has more data about the pilot's readiness than the pilot does, and more data produces more accurate certification, and the authority's record-based clearance outranks the pilot's feeling-based self-assessment. During every season of small aircraft flying, I was not at the certification desk processing the record, while the pilot was in the small cockpit alone, logging hours without the authority's presence in the aircraft. I was in the co-pilot's seat, my beloved child, present for every hour, in every small aircraft. Across every category the record was being built from. You imagined a God who received the logged hours as filed reports, a clearance authority whose involvement with the pilot during the small aircraft season was limited to the administrative processing of a record whose entries arrived at the certification desk the way paperwork arrives at an office, processed without the personal presence of the authority in the aircraft during the hours being logged. I was never at the desk during the flying. I was in the co-pilot seat. For every logged hour, my child, being in the co-pilot seat during small aircraft flying, that the pilot believes is purposeless, is the most specific form of authority-level presence the certification process requires. The authority in the co-pilot seat knows which category the current hour is filling. The pilot in the captain's seat does not. And the gap between what the authority knows about the hour being logged and what the pilot knows about the hour being logged is the gap the authority carries with the specific, I am watching the record being built in real time. I know which column this hour is filling patients of an authority whose certification is being produced by hours the pilot is flying without knowing the hours are producing anything. There were flights during the small aircraft season when the purposelessness was at its most convincing, when the small assignment felt most disconnected from any larger outcome, and the pilot's belief in the connection between small and big was at its thinnest. During those flights, the authority in the co-pilot seat was tracking the hour being logged into the category whose column was closest to its threshold. My dear one, the most purposeless feeling flights were filling the categories closest to completion, and the authority beside the pilot felt the threshold approaching, while the pilot felt the purposelessness deepening. I know the exact flight that almost ended the logging, the specific small aircraft assignment, where the accumulated purposelessness and the comparison with earlier cleared pilots and the thinned belief in the connection converged at a weight whose total produced this specific, I am going to stop flying small and accept that. The large was never part of my certification threshold that a pilot reaches when the small aircraft season has lasted long enough that the pilot begins processing the grounding as relief rather than loss. My dear one, not the first difficult flight, not the most recent, the flight that almost grounded the pilot permanently. The specific assignment where the purposelessness reached its maximum density, and the pilot's internal system calculated whether the continuation of the logging was producing anything the grounding would sacrifice. And the calculation produced a number so close to zero that the continuation and the grounding were separated by the thinnest margin the pilot's system had ever measured. My beloved child, I know that flight because the authority was in the co-pilot's seat when the almost grounding calculation was being performed. The authority was watching the pilot's internal system process the continuation versus grounding assessment from the position of someone who could see what the pilot's calculation was missing. The specific, the hour being logged right now is filling the final threshold of the hardest category information that the pilot's assessment did not contain, because the pilot did not know the categories existed. The almost grounding flight was logging the most critical hour in the entire record. My child, the most critical hour and the almost grounding occurred on the same flight. The pilot who was closest to stopping was closest to completing, and closest to stopping being closest to completing is the specific, cruel. The margin was one flight revelation that the authority carries for a pilot whose record was one logged hour from simultaneous completion. At the moment, the pilot was calculating whether to stop logging entirely. The God who was in the co-pilot's seat during the almost grounding is the God confirming tonight that the flight the pilot almost did not take was the flight that completed the record. Type 1 flight margin. If God just identified the specific assignment that almost grounded the pilot permanently, and the authority in the co-pilot's seat was watching the almost grounding calculation being performed, while the hour being logged during that exact flight was filling the final threshold of the hardest category, meaning the pilot closest to stopping was closest to completing, and the record was 1 logged hour from simultaneous completion. At the moment, the pilot was calculating whether the continuation was producing anything the grounding would sacrifice. Now that the clearance is signed and the certification is in your hands and the largest aircraft is being prepared, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the certified pilot enters the largest cockpit with the authority the record produced, or whether the small aircraft identity interferes with the transition by maintaining the "I only know how to fly" small posture inside a pilot whose certification says otherwise. Climb into the cockpit, not stand on the tarmac holding the clearance document while the small aircraft identity evaluates whether the largest aircraft looks too large from the outside. Not circle the aircraft performing the inspection of a pilot who is searching for reasons the certification might have been issued in error. Climb in. The specific, clearance in hand, authority verified, the record produced this certification. I am the pilot. This aircraft was prepared for entry that converts the certified pilot from a person holding a document into a person operating from the cockpit the document authorizes. My child, climbing in is the act that activates the clearance. A clearance held on the tarmac is a clearance that has not yet produced its operational effect. The operational effect begins when the certified pilot enters the cockpit, and the cockpit responds to the pilot whose record matches the aircraft the cockpit belongs to. And the cockpit of the largest aircraft is designed to respond to the specific pilot whose multi-category record produced the highest certification, meaning the controls will feel right to the hands whose logged hours in small aircraft developed the exact proficiency the largest controls require. When the climbing begins, the small aircraft identity will resist. The resistance says the largest cockpit is unfamiliar. Override the resistance with the record. The record says the cockpit is not unfamiliar. The cockpit is the aircraft the record was always building toward, and building toward is the opposite of unfamiliar. Climb in. The seat was designed for the pilot whose record produced the clearance. The controls will respond to the hands whose hours qualified them. And qualified hands in the correct cockpit is what the entire small aircraft season was always aimed at producing. You made it to the largest cockpit, my beloved child, and I need you to sit in the captain's seat long enough to feel what it means to hold the controls of the aircraft. The entire small aircraft season was building toward in a certification process the pilot did not know existed, until the clearance was placed in hands that had been logging hours in invisible places nobody thought to watch. Feel the cockpit, not the small aircraft, not the seasons of unglamorous assignments that produced no applause and attracted no audience, not the comparison with pilots who were cleared sooner for smaller aircraft, while the viewer's record was accumulating toward the largest certification the system contains, not the purposelessness that classified faithfulness as irrelevant to clearance, not the almost grounding that occurred on the same flight the most critical hour was being logged. The cockpit, the specific largest aircraft, highest certification, the controls respond to these hands. The seat was designed for this pilot cockpit that is now being occupied by the pilot, whose record produced the clearance the authority just issued. The cockpit fits, and fits feels like the opposite of everything the purposelessness was teaching. I want to thank you for something the small aircraft season made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for logging hours nobody counted. Thank you for the boring faithfulness that filled a column the pilot did not know existed. Thank you for the painful faithfulness that filled another. Thank you for the unwitnessed faithfulness that filled the column only invisible hours can reach. Thank you for the faithfulness performed while the unfaithful were visibly rewarded. The column whose threshold is the hardest to reach, because the logging is performed against the visual evidence that the logging is irrelevant. My dear child, thank you for not grounding yourself on the flight that was 1 hour from completing the record, because a grounded pilot's record stops accumulating at the hour the grounding occurs, and 1 hour before completion is the most expensive grounding the certification system has ever calculated. Let the tears come, not purposelessness tears, not small aircraft tears, clearance tears. The tears of a pilot sitting in the largest cockpit, holding a certification that was produced by every invisible hour of small faithfulness that nobody celebrated, undone by the discovery that the small was always building the record, and the record just produced the clearance, and the clearance is for the largest aircraft the pilot has ever seen. Type clearance tears if your tears are forming right now, because you are sitting in the cockpit of the largest aircraft, holding a certification that was produced by every unglamorous, invisible hour of small faithfulness. And the tears are not the grief of the small aircraft season, but the overwhelm of a pilot whose record just produced the highest clearance the system contains, undone by the discovery that every uncelebrated hour was a logged qualification, and every logged qualification was building toward this cockpit. And this cockpit was always the destination the small was always aimed at. You are not the pilot logging hours in small aircraft, wondering whether the hours connect to anything larger, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose small faithfulness was performed in unglamorous, invisible places, that produced no applause and attracted no audience, the one whose belief in the connection between small and big thinned with every unrewarded hour, until the small felt like the permanent destination rather than the qualification process, the one who watched other pilots receive clearance for larger aircraft after apparently fewer hours, and concluded the system was not based on the record, the one whose faithfulness was reclassified as irrelevant to clearance by a futility the disconnection installed, the one whose almost grounding occurred on the same flight the most critical hour was being logged into the final threshold of the hardest category 1 hour before simultaneous completion. That identity was permanently retired the moment the clearance was placed in the pilot's hands and the certification was signed, and the largest cockpit was entered, and the controls responded to hands whose logged hours in the small produced the exact proficiency the largest aircraft requires. You are the certified pilot in the largest cockpit now, and certified changes everything the purposelessness was teaching. The small aircraft identity that governed your relationship with faithfulness, your belief in the connections between small and big, the comparison that made the longer record feel like evidence of absent clearance rather than evidence of largest clearance. The futility that classified the logging as irrelevant, and the purposelessness that converted the faithfulness from investment to maintenance, has been permanently abolished by the evidence of a signed certification, whose every line references the hours that were logged in the small aircraft nobody thought to watch by a pilot, nobody thought to certify. And the certification is the highest the system has ever issued. My dear child, the small was never small. The small was the logging process for the largest clearance. and the largest clearance just proved it. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a pilot whose God certifies faithfulness through flight records. Not a person whose small faithfulness is disconnected from big outcomes. A person whose every invisible hour of small excellence is a logged entry in a certification record, whose clearance the authority issues when the categories are filled and the thresholds are reached, and the record demonstrates the character the largest aircraft requires in the pilot who flies it. Not a person who logs hours without purpose. A person whose purpose is embedded in every hour the logging produces, because every hour is a category being filled, and every category is a threshold being approached, and every threshold is a clearance being built toward. The clearance is signed, the cockpit is entered, the controls respond, and the pilot, whose entire small aircraft season felt purposeless, is now flying the largest aircraft in the hangar with the highest certification the system has ever produced. Certified not by a single dramatic moment, but by the accumulated total of every boring and painful and unwitnessed and unrewarded hour of faithfulness that was logged in places nobody thought to watch by a pilot, nobody thought to certify, but whose record the clearance authority could not deny. Every small hour mattered, every invisible flight was logged, every unglamorous assignment filled a category, and the God who was in the co-pilot seat during every purposeless feeling hour across every small aircraft the pilot ever flew is the same God who signed the clearance and issued the certification and prepared the largest aircraft, and is now sitting in the co-pilot's seat of the largest cockpit, confirming that the faithfulness in the small was always the qualification for the faithfulness in the big, and the big just arrived because the small just completed. Fly, my beloved child. The largest aircraft is yours. The highest clearance is yours. The airspace the small aircraft could never enter is now accessible to the pilot whose record opened it, and the God who is faithful in the big is responding tonight to the pilot who was faithful in the small, because the small and the big were never separate categories, and the record that connects the two was always being maintained by an authority whose certification process was operating the entire time the pilot was flying invisible hours in places nobody thought to watch. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God issues a clearance from a small aircraft flight record, the certification reaches you before the purposelessness convinces you. The logging is irrelevant. You are not a pilot logging uncounted hours in small aircraft anymore. You are a pilot whose highest clearance was produced by the smallest faithfulness, and whose largest cockpit was earned by the most invisible flying. The next message carries the first altitude report from the largest aircraft, and what the highest certification produces when the pilot whose record built it takes the controls at the altitude the clearance authorizes will prove that every small hour was always a logged qualification, and the logged qualification was always building toward the largest aircraft, and the largest aircraft was always waiting for the pilot whose record the authority could not deny. Type hours connected if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the small was never disconnected from the big, but was the sequential first stage of a single certification process. The longer record was evidence of the largest clearance, not the absent one. The comparison with earlier cleared pilots was comparison with different-sized aircraft, requiring different length records. The invisible hour completed the final column. The almost grounding occurred one flight before completion, and the God who was in the co-pilot seat for every logged hour is confirming tonight that you have been faithful in the small things. And now He is being faithful in the big things, because the small produced the record, and the record produced the clearance. And the clearance is for the largest aircraft in the hangar, and the aircraft is yours, and the flying begins now.